Is waiting nothing? Is watching a cipher? Are waiting and watching a waste of time? In Matthew 24:42-51, Jesus admonishes us to keep watch in preparation for his return. And, we established last week, that what he meant by that cannot be that we should do our best to try to discern the date of his return. Not only is that information not available to us, but even if we were somehow able to divine the day and the hour, that knowledge would be of no particular advantage to us. When Jesus prophesies as to the fall of Jerusalem, he gives very specific information, telling of certain signs to watch out for, precisely so that when the city is taken siege, the elect living in and around Jerusalem will have an advantage over the other inhabitants of the holy city. He not only tells them how to know when the time is approaching, but he gives them specific advice in regard to certain strategies for escaping the city alive, and tells them which direction to go, which escape route to take, in order that they might survive the calamity. And, as it turns out, the advice that he gave to his followers proved useful to them. Because, when the Romans took siege of Jerusalem, the 1.1 million Jews who stayed to defend the city lost their lives, while the Christians who remembered what Jesus had said, and who heeded his words fled the city when they saw the signs of its destruction, and they escaped by way of the mountains, and settled in a town called Pella, in Macedonia. Now, in the case of the fall of Jerusalem, the calamity that befell the city was being brought about by the hand of God, but it was being carried out by human agency. In Jerusalem, the destruction was complete, but the scope of the destruction was limited geographically to the region of the Kidron Valley. And, in that case, Jesus called on his disciples to take action after they saw the signs of the coming destruction. But, in the case of the return of Christ, once he appears in the sky, in clouds of glory, it will be too late to take any such action. Because, he will come suddenly, like a thief in the night, in the twinkling of an eye, without further warning, at a day and an hour that is unknown to us, and which will remain unknown to us until it comes. And the scope of his return will not be geographically limited. It will be global. So, keeping watch in preparation for his return has to mean something other than being alert. Because, as I pointed out last week, all that being alert would get you, even if you were somehow able to defy the will of God and discern the day and the hour, would be, maybe, the opportunity to turn to the person next you, and say, "I told you so," before you're both swept away in the judgment, or caught up in the gathering, whatever the case may be. But, the watching that Jesus speaks of in Matthew 24:42-51 he commends to us specifically on the promise that it will accomplish something. According to Jesus, keeping watch, as he uses that turn of phrase, will be of benefit to us, because it will prepare us for, or will keep us prepared for, his return, in such a way so as to secure for us in that day rewards rather than punishments. Matthew 24:42-51. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, "My master is staying away a long time," and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, what does Jesus mean when he advises us to keep watch? Well, it would seem that the idea in view has to do with steadfastness, or reliability. When Jesus says keep watch, what he seems to have in mind is that we would do something that he has already told us to do, and that we would do it steadfastly, reliably, faithfully, dependably, assiduously, sedulously, fiducially. Now this goes hand in hand with the definition of the Greek words Gregorio, agripnia, agripnio, egiro, and nepho, that isn't listed in any Bible dictionary I've been able to find, but which is evident in the way that the word is used in the Bible. This family of words which is translated to watch or to keep watch is often used in the Bible in direct association with prayer, in the same way that the word fasting is used. And, I find that informative. A number of times in the New Testament, fasting and prayer are spoken of in direct connection with one another, and every time, the idea in view seems to be the same. Fasting is presented as an accompanying means into prayer. Now, prayer, on its own, without fasting, is spoken of many, many times in the New Testament. That is, prayer as it is presented to us in the New Testament is oftener undertaken without fasting than it is with fasting. Now, there may be any number of reasons for that. But, I think the most obvious is that prayer, when done on its own, is much more convenient than is prayer which is accompanied by fasting. Now, when I use the word, convenient, it is not my intent to be disparaging, but descriptive. When two things intersect, one way to speak of that intersection is as a convenience. Because, the point at which they intersect is the point at which they convene. To convene is to come together. A convenience is where two paths cross. That's why the little store on the corner is called a convenience store. Because it is stocked and situated in such a way so as to cause your urgent need and their ready supply to convene. You're in the middle of baking a cake and you need milk ASAP, and so you leave the house in search of milk, and while the grocery store is still 2 miles away, just 2 blocks from your house, there's a big sign in front of the gas station that says, Homo Gals $4.99. So, even though that may not be the best use of your money, because at the store, you could get the milk for $3.59, nevertheless, you pull in and buy the milk, and you are grateful for it, because of its convenience. However, if you had planned ahead, then during your regularly scheduled shopping trip you could have picked up an extra gallon of milk, and your dollar would have gone further. Now, there may be any number of reasons why you didn't pick up the milk during your regular shopping trip. Maybe, you forgot. Maybe you didn't know you'd need it. Maybe you're baking a cake because of something that just came up. Maybe you don't have room in your fridge for 2 gallons of milk. Whatever the case may be, I think everyone will recognize that there is a qualitative difference between planned shopping and convenience shopping. Convenience shopping gets you immediate results, which is sometimes very desirable, but it also gets you less bang for your buck. Planned shopping is less convenient, but it tends to get you a higher return on the dollar, which also has its merits. Now, the analogy I am about to make is a crude analogy. It has its shortcomings, but, see if you can follow me anyway. A dichotomy which is very similar to that shopping dichotomy is also at play when it comes to prayer. All prayer is good. But, most of the prayer we engage in is convenient prayer, rather than planned prayer. Most of the prayers we offer up to God are not offered as part of a disciplined prayer life. Most of the prayers we offer up to God are offered in response to some event that is intersecting with our lives. Positive or negative, the great majority of the prayers we pray come about as a result of a convenience that has been visited upon us in response to something that is happening right now. Now, there is certainly nothing wrong with that. Our first response to the events that befall us, both blessings and hardships, ought to be prayer. Prayer ought not to be our last resort, but our first resort. However, the testimony of Scripture is that prayer which is offered up as part of a purposive discipline is of a different quality than is prayer that is offered up spontaneously. Specifically, the Bible represents, over and over both in the Old Testament and in the New, that, when prayer is accompanied by fasting, it holds a certain kind of power, which is greater than that of prayer offered on its own. Now, I don't have time this morning to give a full exposition on this. In the Life of Christ series, when we came to that point in Jesus' life when after being baptized he went out into the desert, where he fasted for 40 days, I taught a lesson demonstrating at some length the fact that fasting is a powerful spiritual discipline, lesson 13 in that series, fast and loose. When people fast, things happen. And prayer offered up with fasting is consistently presented in the Bible as prayer that is of a different category from prayer that is offered up alone. In Psalm 35, David argues before the Lord that he is of a higher moral character than are those who are seeking to kill him. And, as part of the case he makes for himself, he points out that when he prays for his enemies, he does so with fasting. And this, David would seem to be arguing, is evidence of a degree, or a level, of spiritual seriousness that his enemies lacked. Psalm 35, 11-15. Ruthless witnesses come forward, they question me on things I know nothing about. They repay me evil for good, and leave my soul forlorn. Yet, when they were ill, I put on sackcloth, and humbled myself with fasting, praying with my head bowed to my chest. I went about mourning as though for my friend or brother. I bowed my head in grief as though weeping for my mother. But, when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. In Daniel 9, Daniel represents that, when he was faced with a particularly solemn prayer concerned the culmination of the 70 years of the desolation of Jerusalem, he didn't simply pray. Rather, he prayed with fasting. Daniel 9, 1-3. In the first year of Darius son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent, who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and petition, in fasting, and in sackcloth and ashes. In Matthew 17, and in Mark 9, we find the report of the day when 9 of the apostles absent Jesus, Peter, James and John attempted to cast a demon out of a boy, but they failed to accomplish the task. Then, just as the crowds were beginning to turn against them, Jesus showed up, with Peter, James and John, and cast the demon out. A short time later, the apostles came to Jesus and asked him, "Why were we unable to cast it out?" And Jesus answered, "This kind can be driven out only by prayer and fasting." Now, if you read these passages carefully, what you will find is that in that moment, at that time, when confronted with this situation, Jesus did not pray, and he certainly didn't spontaneously undertake to fast. So, Jesus isn't talking about anything convenient here. No, the clear indication of what Jesus says to his disciples here is that there's something about the discipline of praying with fasting that leaves one better prepared for this kind circumstance, for this kind of eventuality. Now, I could give more examples, but no more are needed. You get the point. Prayer is always good, always effective. But, there's something about prayer which is accompanied by fasting that makes it qualitatively different from prayer that is offered up spontaneously. Now, when it comes to spiritual formation, when it comes to spiritual disciplines, there are disciplines of engagement, and disciplines of abstinence. Prayer is a discipline of engagement, as is study, worship, service, fellowship, and so on. But fasting is a discipline of abstinence, as is solitude, silence, chastity, frugality, and so on. And, disciplines of engagement are often paired with, or often go hand in hand with, disciplines of abstinence. For instance, study often goes together with solitude, confession often goes together with secrecy, silence often goes together with service, and so on. And, there are many ways that these disciplines can be paired together, and many ways that they are paired together in the Bible. Now, we have already seen how it is that prayer is often paired together with fasting, and how it is that when the two are paired together they make a powerful combination. Prayer and fasting, when undertaken as interdependent disciplines, prepare the person who undertakes them to be able to do things that people who have not engaged in these disciplines simply cannot do. And that, it would seem, is a spiritual principle that can be generalized. That is, those who fast and pray ought to be better equipped to deal with spiritual matters that emerge spontaneously than those who do not undertake to fast and pray. However, fasting is not the only spiritual discipline that has the power to keep one better prepared for the events that come our way. Another discipline that the Bible commends to us, as an accompanying means into prayer, which will help to keep us in tip-top spiritual condition, is watching. Now when you engage in a discipline of abstinence, you abstain from an otherwise normal activity for the purpose of engaging more deeply in spiritual activity. When one fasts, the otherwise normal activity from which one abstains is eating. When one watches, the otherwise normal activity from which one abstains is sleeping. In Mark 1:35, we read the following. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place, where he prayed. Here, we find Jesus engaging in the discipline of praying and watching. This is not a spontaneous act of prayer, and it isn't a convenient act of prayer. Jesus is acting purposively, deliberately, engaging in a planned time of prayer. And, there are only so many hours in a day. So anyone who wants to engage in the discipline of prayer will very likely have to give up something else in order to make time for that discipline. Now, you could give up lunch, and, if you did, you'd be praying and fasting. But here, Jesus chooses to give up something else, sleep. And he is very intentional about it. He wakes up, early in the morning, leaves the house, and goes out to a solitary place to pray. Now, in this case, the end of the day on which Jesus abstains from sleep is the front end, which is the time of day commended to us by David in Psalm 63:1. O God, you are my God, early will I seek you, my soul thirsts for you, my flesh longs for you, in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. Now, there are people in this world who would have you believe that the only time when one can properly engage in the discipline of prayer and watching is early in the morning. There's a name for people like that. They're called morning people. And, if you ask a morning person, they just may tell you that those get up early to pray, or to meditate, or to read their Bibles, are more spiritual than those who like to sleep in. But, if your body clock is like mine, if you are a person whose biorhythms are such that you are more likely to have spare energy at the end of the day, rather than at the beginning of the day, then I'm happy to declare to you today that staying up late to pray is every bit as spiritual as is getting up early to pray. It is every bit as biblical, and every bit as Christ-like. Luke 6:12-13. And it came to pass, in those days, that he went out into a mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. When morning came, he called his disciples together, and he chose from among them the 12 apostles. And, that's the idea of staying awake to pray that seems to be in view in Ephesians 6:18, where Paul says, "Pray at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end keep watch with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints." And, staying awake, going without sleep to pray, is certainly what's in view in Matthew 26:36-43, when Jesus goes, on the night he was betrayed, to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. And, in this passage, we have an added feature. In this passage, Jesus cites a specific benefit which he says will be gained by those who undertake the discipline of watching and praying. In Matthew 17 and Mark 9, Jesus states that those who undertake to fast and pray will gain spiritual authority, or spiritual power. Specifically, they will gain the authority required to cast out demons of the type with which the apostles had been confronted, but had lacked the authority to command. Well, here, in Matthew 26, and also in a parallel passage, in Mark 14, Jesus states that those who undertake to watch and pray will gain the ability to resist or to overcome temptation. A power which Jesus seems to indicate resides in the body. Mark 14, 37 through 38. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Now, most people take what Jesus says here when he refers to the weakness of the body to refer to the apostles' inability to stay awake. The thrust of his statement being that they want to stay awake, the spirit is willing, but they are simply unable to do so, the body is weak. But, I don't think that that's what Jesus means here. There's nothing wrong with sleeping, when you need sleep. Sleeping isn't a sin, and it isn't a sign of weakness. If it were either of those things, the Bible wouldn't report to us that when the apostles were caught up in a violent storm, and they needed Jesus desperately, he was sound asleep in the hold of the ship. No, the words that Jesus speaks to the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane aren't intended as an indictment against the weakness of the human body because we need sleep. Rather, Jesus is telling the apostles something instructive. He knows they need sleep. But, there's something to be gained by staying awake. If they were to undertake to watch and pray, they would, in the end, be strengthened in their bodies with the ability to resist temptation. After all, sin is a bodily receipt. As Paul says in Romans 7, 5 through 6. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are being delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit. The motions of sin, the pathemata of sin, are at work in our members, in our bodies. But, because of the life of Christ at work in our bodies, we are being delivered from the law of sin and death. And, what Jesus tells us in Mark 14, 37 through 38 is that, when we watch and pray, we are empowered through that discipline to resist temptation. Watching is a spiritual discipline that accomplishes something. When we watch, when we abstain from sleep, and pray, we receive a power, we receive strength that we would not otherwise have, an added power, an added strength, to remain holy, an added power, an added strength, to resist temptation. The spirit is willing, and the body, though it be weak, can be strengthened by watching and praying. Now, that is the meaning that stands behind the idea of keeping watch in Matthew 24, 42 through 44, when Jesus says, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." This isn't just a solemn warning to us that we need to be constantly on our best behavior, because Jesus is lying in wait for us, just waiting to pounce on us, and catch us doing something wrong when he returns. No. Jesus is telling us something here. Something instructive. Something constructive. Something useful. There's something he wants us to do, and he would much rather have us do it, and do it successfully, than punish us for not doing it. So, he advises us in the way of a strategy that will help us to do what he wants us to do. There's a discipline, he says, in which you can engage that will increase the likelihood that you will be able to do my will, when the time to do so comes. And what is that discipline? Watching. Keeping watch. If you keep watch, Jesus says, you will be ready for my return. Because there's something about keeping watch that empowers you to do what I want you to do. And what is it that Jesus wants done? What is it that Jesus sets before his disciples here that is so vital, that it is so important, that doing it or not doing it means the difference between being put in charge of all of his possessions, or being cut to pieces, and thrown into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth? Well, according to verse 45 of Matthew 24, the activity in which Jesus wants his disciples to engage, as a spiritual discipline, undertaken with the accompanying means of watching, is that of seeing to it that his servants are given their food at the proper time. Now, if you want to know more about what that entails, I invite you to go online and listen to lesson number 167 in the Life of Christ series, to give them meat in due season. But, I don't want to go too far afield from where we started last week, or from where I want to go with this lesson, next week. In Luke 24:49, Jesus said to the apostles, "Behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, therefore, wait in the city of Jerusalem until you have been clothed with power from on high." Now, the word that is translated, wait, there, kappa alpha theta sigma alpha tau epsilon, a form of the word, kappa alpha theta zeta omega, does mean, to wait, to tarry, but it does not mean, to loiter. The verb, kappa alpha theta zeta omega, means, among other things, to post watchers, to set guards, to keep watch. And that's exactly what they did. Acts 1:12-14. Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. And they all joined together in continual in prayer, along with the women, and Mary the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. There, in the upper room, the gathered faithful committed themselves to prayer, but not just to prayer but to continual prayer. Which, to me, means that they were praying round the clock non-stop. Now, they may have been doing this in shifts, the Bible doesn't give us the details. But, make no mistake about it, in this season of prayer, people were at the very least taking turns going without sleep. They were keeping watch, fasting from sleep in obedience to what the Lord had commanded them to do. But, it is altogether possible that they were all staying awake, continually, in order to pray without ceasing. Now, you may think that's a ridiculous assertion. Surely, you may be thinking, anyone who is deprived of sleep for longer than about 24 hours will experience many dangerous side effects, such as drowsiness, irritability, concentration and memory difficulties, reduced coordination, impaired judgment, short-term memory problems, raised levels of stress hormones, increased blood sugar levels, and even depression and paranoia. Surely, this would be an unhealthy thing to do. Well, in response, I'd like to point out that there are a number of things commended to us in the Bible that are not good for your health. Crucifixion, as I understand the matter, is particularly bad for one's health, yet the Lord commands us to take up our crosses, daily, and follow him. And, in 2 Corinthians 11:24-29, Paul reports, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was pelted with stones, 3 times I was shipwrecked, I spent a night and a day in the open sea, I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep, I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food, I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? So, no, I wouldn't put it past Peter, James, John, and the others, to deprive themselves of sleep for a whole week. This very thing they just might have done. And, if they did, they might not have suffered, in the process, as much as you might think they would have. The Hebrew word, kava, which is translated, to wait for, is a highly evocative word. At its root, it means to twist, or to stretch, in the sense of a strand of a rope, or a thread in a spider's web, which endures under the tension of strain, precisely because it is collected together with the other strands. Hence, it refers not to something that is done alone, but to something that is done together, in which all the members involved can help to shoulder the burden of the others. Thus, in a sense, each strand is strengthened by the other strands. It is with this sense in view that the word, kava, refers not to a wearisome experience of waiting, in which those who wait languish under the irksome dolor of the tedious, meaningless, and seemingly endless sort, the enduring of which robs one of the will to live. No, rather the waiting in view with the word, kava, is one of great anticipation and expectancy, an experience of eagerly awaiting something with great hope. That's what's in view, for instance, in Isaiah 40, 29-31. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings as eagles, they shall run, and not be weary, and they shall walk, and not faint. And, with this in view, it seems altogether likely to me that, even if the apostles stayed awake for the whole week prior to the day of Pentecost, that this did not wear them out, but invigorated them. After all, the Lord who commanded them to watch and wait in anticipation of the coming of the Holy Spirit knew exactly what they needed to do to prepare them for the work that lay ahead of them. And prepared they were. Is waiting nothing? Is watching a cipher? Are waiting and watching a waste of time? By no means. But wait, there's more. Because, there is yet another aspect to waiting and watching that is vital to understanding what is going on in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, and we'll pick up with that thread next week. That's my lesson for today.